Your sacrifice in the military means nothing if you don't take care of your family, my mother said, her voice like ice, just before my cousin shoved me through the glass wall. As the shards dug into my skin, I heard her tell him, "Just say she slipped. She's always been so clumsy." My name is Ori Bland, and until a few moments ago, I was a former captain in the United States Marine Corps. Now, I wasn't sure what I was. I stood ramrod straight, my training kicking in the center of the sunroom overlooking the relentless port blossom drizzle. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and my mother's expensive perfume. On the mahogany table between us lay a sheaf of papers, a legal surrender, that my cousin Kaylin had just slid in my direction. His eyes gleamed with a greasy, unearned confidence. I didn't move. I just kept my gaze fixed on him, my refusal a silent, solid wall. My mother, Genevieve, let out a long, theatrical sigh. It was a sound engineered for an audience, a sigh that carried the weight of her manufactured disappointment. "Ori, darling," she began, her voice a weapon wrapped in velvet. It was as sweet as southern honey and as cold as tempered steel. "Your sacrifice in the service was admirable, truly, but it means nothing if you don't know how to take care of your family." The words weren't advice, they were a verdict, a carefully aimed shot designed to strip me of the one thing I had left: my honor. Across the table, Kaylin's lips twisted into a cruel smirk. The look was unmistakable. "See? Even your own mother thinks you're worthless." And in that freezing, silent moment, the truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a discussion. It wasn't a family meeting. It was an ambush. The signal was a nearly invisible flick of Genevieve's chin, a commander's silent order. Emboldened, Kaylin moved. He didn't just push. He shoved, throwing his entire dead weight into my shoulder. My balance, honed on obstacle courses and unsteady terrain, failed me on the polished hardwood floor of my own home. My body hurtled backward, my arms flailing for something that wasn't there. There was a sickening crack, the sound of tension giving way, of integrity failing. Then, a sound that ripped the air apart, a deafening crystalline shatter as the floor-to-ceiling glass wall exploded into 1,000 glittering knives. A raw, wet gust of wind rushed in, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp soil, shocking my skin. It was followed by a sharp, searing pain as shards of glass bit into the flesh of my arm and cheek. The warm wool of my cashmere sweater turned dark and wet as blood began to seep through. But the physical pain, the burning and the stinging, was nothing. It was a dull echo compared to the absolute shock of looking up and meeting my mother's eyes. There was no horror, no concern, no flicker of maternal love. There was only a cold, detached calculation. I was no longer her daughter. I was a problem to be managed, an obstacle in her path. Genevieve and Kaylin stood motionless, two predators observing their fallen prey. I watched my mother's brow furrow slightly, but not with worry for me. A single, bright red droplet of my blood had arced through the air and landed on the pristine toe of her black Stuart Weitzman stiletto. With a gesture of such casual, horrifying indifference, it stopped my breath. She withdrew a silk Hermes scarf from her handbag. She bent down, not toward me, but toward her foot. She carefully, meticulously, wiped the single red droplet away. She never once looked at my face. That single silent action screamed louder than the shattering glass. It told me everything I needed to know. My worth, measured and dismissed in that instant, was less than a pair of shoes. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you meant less to someone than an object? If you have, you know the silence that followed. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt that kind of cold. Then she straightened up, her composure perfect, and spoke to Kaylin, her voice flat and even. "Just say she slipped," she instructed, as if dictating a grocery list. "She's always been so clumsy." A pre-packaged lie, a final twisting knife to my dignity. Lying there, surrounded by the glittering debris of my life, I didn't cry. The pain was a distant signal. The shock was a fog. But something else rose through it, something hard and sharp and familiar. The training, hammered into me in the dust and heat of Fallujah, took over. The disciplined mind of a Marine captain pushed the broken heart of a daughter aside. Emotion, is a liability. The mission is all that matters. Assess the situation. Protect the asset. Tactical retreat. I moved slowly, deliberately, pushing myself up from the floor. I ignored the sharp protest of my muscles, the grinding of glass under my hands. I walked, steady and silent, through the gaping, jagged hole where the wall used to be, out into the cold, cleansing rain. I didn't look back. I heard my mother's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the air behind me. "Ori, you get back here right now." Her orders were nothing to me now. They were just empty noise. I climbed into the driver's seat of my old Ford F-150, the one thing that was truly mine. My hands, when I placed them on the wheel, were shaking. Not from fear or from pain, but from a white-hot, suppressed rage that threatened to consume me. But discipline won. It always did. I reached under the passenger seat and pulled out my IFAC, my individual first aid kit. With methodical calm, I opened an antiseptic wipe, the smell of alcohol sharp and clean. I gritted my teeth as I cleaned the cuts, my breath hissing through my clenched jaw. I applied pressure, then expertly wrapped the bandages, the motions automatic, ingrained by years of practice. The work done, I finally allowed myself to look in the rearview mirror. The house, once my sanctuary, my family home, stared back. It was no longer a home. It was a compromised structure, a hostile environment. It was ground zero. And the battle to reclaim it had just begun. Driving north on Interstate 5 towards Seattle, my world was reduced to the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers and the watery, distorted streaks of city lights. The pain in my arm was a dull, persistent throb, a physical anchor to the fresh wound in my memory. Each red taillight blooming in the rain felt like a drop of my own blood on the dark asphalt. The image of the house, my father's house, shimmered and then faded in the rearview mirror. I could almost smell the sweet, earthy scent of cedar from his workshop, feel the comfortable weight of his hand on my shoulder as he taught me to identify the rings of a tree. That warmth dissolved into the cold Seattle mist, replaced by a memory that was sharper, colder, and etched into my soul. The day of my father's funeral. My dad, Frank Bland, a retired Navy Chief Petty Officer who'd served on the USS Midway, had been clear about one thing. He wanted a proper military burial. Full honors. I had just returned from a deployment and made it my mission to see it done right. I'd coordinated everything with the Navy Honor Guard. I can still feel the weight of that perfectly folded American flag in my hands. The 13 folds, the tight, solemn triangles of the stars and stripes, represented a life of duty. Holding it was a painful privilege, a crushing mixture of profound pride and bottomless grief. I was ready to honor him. But my mother, Genevieve, had other plans. Just before the service was to begin, she pulled me into a private viewing room at the Greenwood Funeral Home in Renton. The air was heavy with the cloying scent of white lilies and expensive tea roses. "Ori," she said, her voice a soft whisper that allowed no argument. "I need you to tell those sailors to take the flag away." I stared at her, the flag in my arms suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. "What are you talking about?" This was Dad's final wish. Genevieve sighed, her face a mask of weary patience, as if my grief were an inconvenience. "It's just too gaudy, Ori. Too overtly patriotic. It clashes with the floral arrangements and the elegant atmosphere I'm trying to create." She gestured around the room at the carefully curated performance of Sorrow. "Your father would understand." She had turned my father's funeral into a social event. His flag, the symbol of his 30 years of service, of his honor, of his very identity, was just an unfashionable accessory. I fought her. I pleaded, my voice choked. It was useless. Genevieve had already outmaneuvered me, laying the groundwork for her deception. She moved through the clusters of mourners, her hand on Kaylin's arm, whispering that I was confused, that I was overwrought with grief and my PTSD was acting up, that I was mistaken about my father's wishes. Kaylin stood beside her, his face a perfect picture of solemn concern, nodding along. She's always been one to over-dramatize things, I heard him murmur to our uncle. In front of our family and friends, I was painted as the unstable daughter, the broken soldier disrupting a sacred ceremony. I was silenced, humiliated. I had to stand there, helpless, and watch as they carried my father's casket, bare and unadorned, without the flag he had earned 100 times over. The pain of losing him was multiplied, sharpened by the sting of public shame and utter isolation. I retreated to a corner, a ghost at my own father's funeral, while my mother and Kaylin stood at the center of it all, accepting condolences, perfectly performing their roles in the tragic play they had written. The memory vanished as a single hot tear escaped and traced a path down my cheek in the cold anonymity of my new apartment on Capitol Hill. I wiped it away, not with sadness, but with a fierce, burning anger. This wasn't a tear of weakness. It was molten fury. I finally understood that what happened today, the shove, the shattered glass, wasn't an isolated incident. It was the climax of a long, systematic campaign of betrayal, a war of attrition against my honor and my father's. My mind went back to his workshop. I was a teenager, clumsily trying to help him varnish an old oak chair he was restoring. He had stopped my hand, his own calloused and sure, and said, "Honor, Ori girl, honor is like this final coat of varnish. It's clear, it's strong, and it protects everything underneath. You don't ever let anyone scratch it." I looked at the fresh, angry red line on my arm, the one I had just bandaged. They had scratched it. They had tried to break it. That night, sleep was impossible. The rain beat a steady rhythm against the window, a somber drumbeat for the war I was about to wage. I opened my laptop. The screen cast a pale, determined light on my face in the darkness. My fingers found the keys, but the first words I typed weren't a cry for help or a journal entry of my pain. They were a mission objective, a title: Operation Reclaim Fort Bland. Operation Reclaim Fort Bland didn't start with lawyers or reconnaissance missions. It started with an aching back and the humbling reality of survival. The first few days in Seattle were a test of endurance, a brutal re-entry into a world where my rank and my service record meant nothing. I, a former captain in the Marine Corps, took the jobs no one else wanted. I learned to improvise, adapt, and overcome. Not on a battlefield, but in the sprawling, indifferent city. My days were spent at an Amazon fulfillment center out in Kent. It was a world of concrete floors, fluorescent lights, and the constant hum of conveyor belts. I walked miles, scanning, lifting, packing. My muscles, trained for rucks and patrols, screamed in protest against the repetitive industrial rhythm. I was just another anonymous worker in a bright yellow vest, a cog in a machine so vast it was dizzying. Each box I packed, each label I scanned, was a silent act of defiance against the voice in my head that whispered I was useless. My nights were spent in Fremont, at a small, independently owned gym. After the last member left, my second shift began. I pushed a mop, the smell of disinfectant sharp in the empty space. I cleaned sweat-smudged mirrors, seeing a dozen tired reflections of myself. I scrubbed toilets and wiped down equipment, my hands, once steady enough to field strip a rifle in the dark, growing calloused and raw from bleach and scouring pads. My dinners were eaten in the cold solitude of a bus stop, the city's gray, damp chill seeping into my bones. A can of soup, heated in the microwave of my tiny, bare apartment. A loaf of bread that had to last the week. The persistent Seattle drizzle seemed to mirror the loneliness that clung to me, a constant, heavy mist. But in my eyes, there was no despair. There was only the steely focus of a mission. Every drop of sweat, every aching muscle, was a message sent directly to Genevieve and Kaylin. You did not break me. After 2 weeks of this relentless grind, I received my first paychecks. One from Amazon, one from the gym. I stood under the awning of a U.S. bank, out of the rain, and stared at the numbers. The total was just over $800. $817.42 to be exact. It was nothing. A fraction of what I once had, a rounding error in my mother's world of luxury. But as I looked at those flimsy pieces of paper, a profound sense of reverence washed over me. This wasn't just money. This was sacred. This was currency earned not from inheritance or privilege, but from sweat and perseverance. This was the coin of my survival. The first installment on my independence. I didn't deposit the checks. I walked inside and cashed them, asking the teller for small bills. I wanted to feel it. I stood on the street corner and counted the worn, crinkled 20s and 10s, feeling the physical weight of my freedom in my hands. That night, I didn't eat canned soup. I walked past the bus stop and into a small, brightly lit American diner, the kind with red vinyl booths and the smell of coffee and frying bacon hanging in the air. I slid into a booth, the cracked vinyl cool against my skin, and I ordered a Salisbury steak with a double helping of mashed potatoes and gravy. When it arrived, steaming and hearty on a thick ceramic plate, I ate slowly. It wasn't just a meal, it was a ceremony. A personal commendation for a battle fought and won. My quiet, diligent presence at the gym hadn't gone unnoticed. The owner, a man named Sully, was a big, broad-shouldered ex-firefighter with kind, weary eyes that had seen too much. He rarely spoke to me beyond a simple, "good night," but I'd sometimes feel his gaze on me as I worked. One night, during a torrential downpour, he found me on my 10-minute break, huddled in the small break room. I was reading a thick, dog-eared textbook on real estate law I'd bought at a used bookstore, my lips pressed into a thin line of concentration. The words were dense, the concepts alien, but I attacked them like a tactical manual. Sully just nodded and walked away. I figured he thought I was strange. The next evening, when I arrived for my shift, I found a thermos sitting on the counter in the break room. It was still warm. Next to it was a neatly wrapped turkey sandwich on thick, whole wheat bread. A small handwritten note was tucked beside it, the handwriting a rugged scrawl. It said, "Keep fighting. Looks like you're studying for a big one." That simple, unasked-for kindness did what all the hardship and betrayal couldn't. It broke through the ice that had formed around my heart. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen. Not as a failure, not as a charity case, but as a fighter. Someone who was studying for a big one. He was right. Bolstered by Sully's quiet encouragement and a newfound sliver of confidence, I decided it was time. The reconnaissance phase of the operation had to begin. I took a small portion of my hard-earned cash and went to a pawn shop downtown. I bought a cheap, prepaid burner phone and a scuffed, older model laptop. They weren't much, but they were tools. They were weapons. That night, in my small, quiet apartment, I set up my new command center. The laptop hummed to life, its pale light illuminating my determined face. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I didn't search for my mother's name. I didn't search for Kaylin. Their patterns were predictable. I needed an ally whose loyalty was forged not in blood, but in fire. I typed a different name into the search bar. A name from my past, from my service. The only person I trusted to understand the nature of this war. Zara Kincaid. Hitting enter was the first step out of the darkness. It was the first shot fired. It was the moment I stopped defending and started to attack. The address Zara Kincaid sent me led to an old brick building in Pioneer Square, one of those historic structures that had survived fires and earthquakes. Her office wasn't what I expected. There was no frosted glass door with a stenciled name, no overflowing filing cabinets. It was less like a private investigator's office and more like a tactical operations center. It was minimalist, clean, and efficient, dominated by a large desk and a bank of monitors displaying streams of data. The only decoration was a framed Marine Corps flag on the wall. Zara stood as I entered. With her short cropped hair and sharp, restless eyes that seemed to see everything, she looked as formidable as I remembered. There was no hug, no comforting arm on my shoulder. That wasn't her way. That wasn't our way. She just gave me a curt nod and pushed a steaming ceramic mug of black coffee across her desk toward me. It was strong enough to strip paint. "Situation report, Captain," she said. Her tone was exactly the same as it had been a decade ago in the field. There was no pity in it, no condescension, just respect. And with that simple, direct command, the floodgates opened. For the first time, I told the whole story. I didn't stumble, I didn't cry. I delivered it like a formal after-action report, my voice steady and clear. I started with my father's funeral, with the dishonored flag, and ended with the shattering glass and the chilling sight of my mother wiping my blood off her expensive shoes. Through it all, Zara listened. She didn't interrupt. Her face remained a neutral mask, her gaze locked on mine, absorbing every detail. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. It stretched for a long moment, filled only by the quiet hum of the computers. I braced myself for the questions, for the doubt, for the, "Are you sure you didn't misunderstand?" that I had come to expect from the world, from my own family. Instead, Zara leaned forward slightly. She pointed a single, steady finger, not at me, but at the faint, healing scar on my cheek. "Hostile inflicted wound," she stated, her voice flat and decisive. She then leaned back, her eyes narrowing. "Target identified. Rules of engagement will be established." Just a few words, a handful of military phrases. But in that moment, they were the most healing words I had ever heard. She didn't just believe me. She validated my entire reality. She didn't see a clumsy daughter who slipped. She saw a fellow soldier wounded by an enemy. For someone who had been systematically doubted and dismissed by her own mother, this unconditional trust was like cool water on a burn. The immense weight I'd been carrying alone, the crushing burden of my truth, suddenly felt lighter. It was cut in half. That evening, Zara wouldn't let me go back to my empty apartment. "No soldier gets left behind," she said simply, grabbing her coat. She drove us to Georgetown, a gritty industrial neighborhood in South Seattle, and pulled up in front of a place called the Tin Hat. It was an old, unassuming tavern, the kind of local bar that had been there for generations. The moment we stepped inside, I felt a sense of comfort. The air was warm, smelling of old wood, spilled beer, and frying onions. It was filled with the low rumble of conversation and easy laughter. Against the far wall, a place of honor was reserved. It was an exposed brick wall, covered with dozens of black and white portraits. "The Wall of Honor," Zara said, her voice softer now. It was a memorial to local service members who had been killed in action. She led me to it. My eyes scanned the faces, young men and women, smiling in their uniforms, frozen in time. And then I saw him. A photograph of my father, Frank Bland, taken when he was just a young sailor. His Navy uniform was crisp, his smile wide and full of life. He looked invincible. Beneath the photo was a small polished brass plaque. It read, "Chief Petty Officer Frank Bland, served with honor." Here, in this noisy, humble bar, surrounded by strangers, my father's legacy was revered. The honor my own mother had so casually stripped from him was proudly displayed for all to see. A wave of emotion, hot and overwhelming, washed over me. I reached out a trembling hand and gently touched the cool brass of the plaque. A single tear I didn't know I was holding back escaped and rolled down my cheek. We were sitting at the bar, nursing a couple of beers, when a vibration broke the fragile peace. It was my old phone, the one I had kept purely for monitoring purposes. The screen lit up with Kaylin's name. Zara saw my expression change. She simply nodded, a silent command to answer it. "Put it on speaker," she mouthed. I took a breath and swiped to answer. Kaylin's voice filled the small space around us. It wasn't angry or demanding. It was a sickeningly sweet, syrupy tone, the one he used when he wanted something. "Ori? Oh, thank God. Where have you been? Mom's been worried sick. She's been crying constantly." I said nothing. "Listen, sis," he went on, his voice oozing false concern. "Just come home. Everybody misses you. We can work this out." The fragile sense of safety I'd felt just moments before was ripped away. The warm, comforting atmosphere of the bar suddenly felt cold and exposed. The long, toxic shadow of my family had reached me even here, in this sanctuary. It was a poison that could seep in anywhere. I ended the call without a word, my hand clenching into a fist so tight my knuckles turned white. The battle wasn't just back in Port Blossom. It had followed me. It was here. And it was far from over. A few days after the phone call, they found me, I was finishing my cleaning shift at Sully's gym, the smell of bleach still clinging to my clothes when they appeared in the doorway. It was a jarring sight. My mother, Genevieve, wrapped in a classic Burberry trench coat, looked utterly out of place against the backdrop of worn-out treadmills and stacked weights. She was a specter from another world, a world of country clubs and cocktail parties. Behind her stood Kalen, his shoulders slumped, his face a carefully constructed mask of remorse. Genevieve's eyes landed on me, and she immediately put a hand to her chest, her expression a perfect performance of pained relief. "Ori." "Oh, thank God we found you," she said, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. She moved toward me, holding out a white pastry box tied with a neat blue ribbon. "I baked you a Lady Baltimore cake. It was always your father's favorite." The name of the cake hit me like a physical blow. It was a deliberate, calculated strike at the softest part of my memory. The sweet, almond-laced cake she only ever made for my father's birthday. It was a memory of a time when we almost felt like a real family. "I know I was wrong, darling," she continued, her eyes welling up with perfectly timed tears. "I was just so scared. I wasn't thinking clearly. Can you find it in your heart to forgive your foolish old mother?" The performance was flawless. The trembling voice, the glistening tears, the sacred offering of a memory. And for a treacherous, heartbreaking second, a small, forgotten part of me, the little girl who had spent a lifetime craving her mother's love, wanted to believe her. It was a desperate, foolish flicker of hope in the darkness. They invited me for coffee at a small cafe nearby, a place with round marble tables and the hiss of an espresso machine. I went, against my better judgment, against Zara's warnings. I think I just needed to see the play through to its final act. Genevieve launched into a monologue of her sleepless nights, of her profound regret. She described Kalen's remorse in vivid detail, how he hadn't been able to eat, how he was devastated by what he'd done. It was a textbook display of love bombing, a relentless assault of affection and apologies designed to lower my defenses. And once she felt she had me softened up, she casually, expertly, dropped the hook into the water. "You know, darling, Kalen has been having a bit of a rough time with his latest business venture," she said, her tone light, as if she were discussing the weather. She took a delicate sip of her latte. "His project is so promising, a real game changer, but he just needs a small bridge loan to get him over the final hump. The bank, you know how they are, they require a cosigner with secured assets. It's just a formality, really." Her words floated gently across the table, soft and reasonable. But I felt an invisible iron trap slowly closing around me. A cold dread crept up my spine. They didn't come for me. They didn't bake a cake for me. They came for the house. Kalen, on cue, leaned forward, his eyes wide with feigned sincerity. "It's just a signature, Ori. That's it. As soon as the funding comes through, I'll pay you back double. We can be a family again, sis, the way we are meant to be." The request, so casually delivered, became more monstrous with every word. We were never meant to be a family. We were a toxic contract, and I was just now reading the fine print. Genevieve reached across the table and placed her cool, manicured hand over mine. Her touch felt like a spiderweb. "Do this for your father, Ori," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He would never have wanted to see his family torn apart like this." That was it. That was the final, unforgivable straw. They were using him. They were using the memory of the very man whose honor they had desecrated at his own funeral. They were holding my love for him hostage to fuel their own greed. The faint, hopeful flicker inside me didn't just die, it was violently extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard ash. My eyes, when I lifted them to meet my mother's, felt like chips of ice. The fog of hope and confusion vanished, revealing the ugly, naked truth of the situation. I looked straight into her eyes, past the mask of loving concern, and I saw it. Not remorse, not love, just a bottomless, insatiable greed. She was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and I had finally heard her howl. I slowly, deliberately, pulled my hand out from under hers. The warmth of my own skin felt foreign after her cold touch. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The movement was calm, measured. No, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it filled the space between us with an absolute, unshakable weight. No, never again. Genevieve's face froze. For a split second, the mask of the heartbroken mother fell away completely, revealing the raw, startled anger beneath. How dare you, she hissed, her voice losing its gentle tremor. Kalen started to rise from his chair, a low growl forming in his throat. Ori, don't you walk away from... I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a $10 bill, and placed it on the table to cover my coffee. Then I turned and walked away. I wasn't running. I wasn't fleeing. I was strategically withdrawing from a battle I'd already won simply by refusing to fight on their terms. As I stepped out of the cafe and into the clean, crisp Seattle air, a profound sense of release washed over me. The last, stubborn vestiges of illusion had been burned away. Now, there was only the war. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't throw things. I didn't scream into a pillow. The rage that had been simmering under the surface had cooled, hardening from a molten liquid into something sharp, focused, and deadly. My grief had burned away, leaving behind the cold, hard steel of purpose. I walked straight to the small oak box my father had made for me years ago, its joints perfect, its surface smooth as glass. It was where I kept my real treasures, not jewelry or stocks, but things that mattered. My service medals, a handful of letters, a photo of my unit. I lifted the lid and the faint scent of cedar and old paper filled the air. My fingers brushed past the neatly folded fabric of my dress blues until I found what I was looking for, a bundle of old letters tied with a faded ribbon. Tucked inside was an envelope I hadn't seen in years. It was addressed to me at Paris Island, dated the week I had shipped out for boot camp. But it had never been sent. His familiar, strong handwriting filled the page. My father's voice, clear and steady, echoed in my mind as I read the words. They will try to break you, Ori girl. The world will. But they don't know you're made of the same steel they build warships from. Don't ever let anyone, not a soul on this earth, put a cheap price tag on you. Not even your mother. The letter trembled in my hands. It was a message from the past, a final order from my commanding officer, a posthumous blessing for the war I was about to declare. Reading those words, my cold fury was distilled into a single, pure objective. This was no longer about a house. It was about honor. It was about reclaiming the legacy my father had left me, the one my mother had tried so hard to erase. I was fighting for him now, and for myself. I immediately switched into war mode. The small kitchen table became my command center. I laid out every piece of potential ammunition I had. A copy of the deed to the house, printouts of old text messages from Kalen, a long whining history of him asking for money, bank statements I had saved showing a pattern of suspicious withdrawals from a joint account Genevieve had access to. I opened my new laptop. There was no hesitation. I created an encrypted file, a digital fortress for my intelligence. And I began to write. I documented every incident, every manipulative conversation, every veiled threat going back years. This wasn't a diary of my pain. This was an indictment. It was an intelligence dossier on the enemy. Every small lie, every broken promise, every act of casual cruelty was no longer a source of pain. It was a bullet. And my magazine was getting full. But even with this preliminary evidence, I knew I couldn't storm the fortress alone. A soldier is only as good as her unit. It was time to assemble my team. I picked up the prepaid burner phone. The first call was to Zara Kincaid. She answered on the second ring. Zara, it's Ori, I said, my voice cold and clipped. There was no preamble. The love-bombing phase failed. They showed their hand. I need full reconnaissance. Digital, financial, everything you can dig up. Start with Kalen Vance. There was a beat of silence on the other end, then Zara's voice, as efficient as a well-oiled machine. Understood. Commencing immediately. The second call was to Julian Thorne. He was a sharp, no-nonsense financial advisor who specialized in working with veterans, a man who understood that for us, security was about more than just numbers. Julian, It's Ori Bland. I need you to run a full audit on all my joint accounts and then freeze them. Immediately. And I need you to start the paperwork to move all my personal assets into an irrevocable trust. Today. Consider it done, Captain, he replied, his voice calm and reassuring. I'll send the documents to your secure email by 5 p.m. One call for intelligence, one for financial defense. The last call was the most critical. It was the artillery. I took a deep, steadying breath and dialed the number for Silas Croft, one of the most respected and feared litigators in Seattle. He was known for his quiet demeanor, his strategic mind, and for systematically dismantling his opponents in court. A calm, professional voice answered. Croft's office. This is Captain Ori Bland, I said, my voice steady, my rank a shield and a sword. I need to speak with Mr. Croft. It's urgent. After a brief hold, a deep, confident voice came on the line. This is Silas Croft. Mr. Croft, I began. I need to retain your services for a war. I have evidence, I have a clear objective, and I have the will to see this through to the end. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his strategic mind. Then, his voice came back, calm and resonant with a quiet power. Captain Bland, he said, my office opens at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Bring everything you have. I hung up the phone and walked to the window. The Seattle night was still dark, the sky a blanket of impenetrable clouds, but for the first time since I'd come home, I could see a sliver of light on the horizon. It's an amazing feeling, isn't it? That moment when you stop just reacting and start planning your counterattack. If you've ever had a moment like that, where you decided to take back control, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. It's a turning point we should all celebrate. It was the dawn, and I was ready for it. At precisely 9 a.m. the next morning, I stepped into the offices of Silas Croft. It was on a high floor of a downtown Seattle skyscraper with a panoramic view of Elliott Bay that screamed power and success. The space itself was immaculate, organized, and exuded a quiet, lethal confidence. This was not an office for frivolous lawsuits. This was a command center for high-stakes warfare. I spread my entire dossier across the vast polished surface of his mahogany conference table. The bank statements, the printouts of Kalen's texts, the timeline of events I had painstakingly reconstructed. Silas, a calm, composed man in a tailored suit and horn-rimmed glasses, examined each document with the meticulous focus of a surgeon studying an X-ray. He didn't offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. That wasn't what I was paying him for. Instead, he started asking questions, each one a scalpel slicing through my assumptions, exposing my vulnerabilities. Do they have access to your mailbox? He asked, his eyes not leaving a bank statement. I don't know, I guess. Does anyone else have a key to the house? Genevieve and Kalen. When was the last time you checked your credit report? The question hung in the air. I had never checked it. Each question he asked revealed a potential flank I hadn't considered, a new front on which they could attack. I had been so focused on the emotional betrayal that I hadn't seen the tactical landscape. This wasn't just about a house anymore, it was an information war, and I was dangerously exposed. In the middle of our strategy session, the door opened without a knock. Zara Kincaid strode in, all business, and placed a tablet on the table in front of Silas. She swiped the screen, bringing up a complex web of connections that looked like a spider's web. Kalen's drowning, she said, her voice flat. But not in business debt. Gambling debt. Silas and I both looked at her. He owes a loan shark in Tacoma just shy of $80,000, she continued, pointing to a name on the screen. The guy has a reputation. Kalen needs money, and he needs it yesterday. This new intelligence changed everything. It explained their desperation, their recklessness. Kalen wasn't just greedy, he was terrified. And a terrified man is a dangerous and unpredictable animal. Silas nodded slowly, absorbing the information. That explains the urgency, he murmured. A desperate man makes mistakes. As if on cue, Zara swiped to another screen. There's more, she said. Genevieve has had 2 meetings in the last week with a real estate broker named Roderick Vance. The man's a bottom feeder, specializes in flipping properties with disputed ownership. He's known for pushing through quick, dirty sales. The trap was being set. They weren't just planning to ask me to sign. They were already preparing to sell the house out from under me, with or without my consent. While Silas and Zara analyzed the new intel, my attention drifted to the small oak box I had brought with me, the one containing my father's things. I wasn't sure why I'd brought it, but it felt like I needed him in the room. I idly flipped through an old ledger where he used to track his woodworking projects, the pages filled with his neat, strong handwriting. And then, tucked between the last two pages, my fingers found something that didn't belong, a single folded document. I carefully opened it. It was a handwritten agreement, dated just after I'd left for boot camp. It was signed by my father, Frank Bland, and my mother, Genevieve Bland. It had been notarized by one of my father's old Navy buddies. My breath caught in my throat as I read the clear, simple text. In the event of my death, Frank Bland, sole ownership of the property at Port Blossom, will be transferred to our daughter, Captain Ori Bland, as a reward for her service to our country. Genevieve Bland is granted the right to reside in the property for the remainder of her natural life, but possesses no right to sell, transfer, or use the property as collateral for any loan. I read it again and again. My hands were shaking. This wasn't just a letter, this was a legal document. This was a shield my father had forged for me from beyond the grave. This was the ultimate weapon. I pushed the paper across the table to Silas. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the text. I watched as his calm, professional demeanor shifted. A slow, brilliant light began to burn in his eyes. He looked up from the paper, first at me, then at Zara. "This," he said, his voice filled with a newfound, confident energy, "is everything we need." He tapped the document with his index finger. "The game has changed. We are no longer on the defensive. We are going on the attack." He immediately turned to his computer and began typing, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He drafted a sharp, formal legal letter. But he didn't address it to Genevieve or Kaylin. He addressed it directly to Roderick Vance, the shady real estate broker, and to the loan department of the bank Kaylin was trying to borrow from. The letter was a warning shot across their bow, alerting them to potential fraudulent activity and imminent legal disputes regarding the property. He attached a scanned copy of the notarized agreement. He hit send. The trap was laid. Silas Croft leaned back in his chair and, for the first time since I'd met him, he smiled. It was a cold, sharp, predatory smile. "And now," he said, a dangerous glint in his eye, "we sit back and watch the rats scurry right into our trap." The confrontation was no longer a distant possibility. It had a time and a place, and we were ready for it. The meeting was set for 10 a.m. in Silas Croft's conference room. The air inside felt pressurized, still and heavy like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. From our vantage point high above the city, the waters of Elliott Bay looked cold and gray. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, with Silas on my right and Zara on my left. We were a silent, solid front. We didn't speak. We had done all our speaking. Now, we just waited. Genevieve and Kaylin arrived precisely on time, accompanied by their lawyer, a slick, overconfident man in a pinstripe suit that was too expensive for his talent. They walked in with the swagger of victors, fully believing this was their final negotiation, the moment they would finally corner me into signing away my home. Genevieve offered me a condescending, pitying smile, the kind a queen might give to a difficult but ultimately powerless subject. "I'm so glad you decided to be reasonable, dear," she said, her voice dripping with a false magnanimity that made my skin crawl. Kaylin, ever her loyal lapdog, didn't even make eye contact. He sank into a plush leather chair across from me, crossed his legs, and leaned back with an air of smug superiority. He was already spending the money in his head, already planning his triumphant return from the brink of failure. Their lawyer cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to echo in the tense silence, and began his presentation. He laid out what he condescendingly called a most generous offer. They would allow me, in their benevolence, to keep a small percentage of the property's sale price. It was a pittance designed to placate me, a few crumbs tossed from my own table to keep me quiet. He spoke with the slow, deliberate tone of a man explaining something simple to a child, as if he were doing me the greatest favor of my life. Silas let him finish his entire spiel. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue or object. When the lawyer was done, Silas simply, quietly, slid Zara's tablet across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of their counsel. He pressed a single icon on the screen. Kaylin's voice, sickly sweet and dripping with calculated concern, suddenly filled the silent room. "Ori? Oh, thank God, where have you been? Mom's been worried sick. She's been crying constantly." The recording from the bar played out, every manipulative, cloying word echoing off the soundproofed glass walls. The air crackled. Then Silas swiped the screen. A series of Kaylin's text messages appeared, projected onto the large monitor at the end of the room. The ones that came after the call, when his sweet act had failed. They were aggressive, demanding, and filled with veiled threats. "You're being selfish. You owe us this. Don't make me come find you." I watched Kaylin's face. The smug confidence evaporated like mist, replaced by a pasty, panicked shock. His lawyer stiffened, his professional veneer cracking under the sudden, unexpected assault. "This is an illegal recording," he blustered, pointing an accusing finger at the tablet, his voice a little too loud. Silas simply shrugged, a small dismissive movement of his shoulders. "The state of Washington has one-party consent," he said, his voice calm and even, a cool counterpoint to the lawyer's agitation. "Completely legal." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding the lawyer's. "And that was just the appetizer." Zara spoke for the first time, her voice low and steady, but it carried the force of a battering ram. "Perhaps we should discuss your gambling debts, Kaylin." She projected a new image onto the screen. It was a complex flowchart showing a series of erratic, desperate financial transactions. Multiple cash advances from high-interest credit cards, pawnshop loans against non-existent collateral, and finally, a large inbound transfer from an account known to be controlled by a notorious loan shark in Tacoma. The chart was followed by a grainy, time-stamped security photo of Kaylin at an underground casino. His face pale and slick with sweat, illuminated by the ghostly green glow of a poker table. Kaylin looked like he had been turned to stone. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out. He was a fish on a hook, gasping for air. The slick lawyer stared at the screen, his own face now a mask of disbelief and horror. But Silas wasn't finished. He reached into his leather briefcase, the latches clicking open with a sound like a rifle bolt being drawn. He retrieved a single, folded document. He let it fall onto the center of the table. It landed with a soft, final thud that seemed to seal their fate. "And this, Mrs. Bland," Silas said, his gaze pinning Genevieve to her chair, "is your husband's final testament, the one you conveniently forgot to mention." He slid the document across the mahogany to their lawyer. A profound, suffocating silence descended on the room as the man unfolded the paper and read the handwritten agreement. I watched the color drain from his face. I saw his eyes widen, saw the flicker of sheer panic as he realized the depth of the legal and financial hole his clients had dug for themselves. He knew. It was over. The game was lost. Checkmate. Kaylin, finally snapping out of his stupor, turned to his mother, his voice a desperate, cracking whisper. "Mom! Do something! Say something!" Genevieve stared at the document, then at the lawyer's ashen face, then at the implacable, united front of our team. The calculation in her eyes was frantic. I could see her survival instincts, honed over a lifetime of prioritizing herself above all others, kicking into high gear. She was a cornered animal, and she would chew off her own leg, or her own son's, to escape. She turned on Kaylin. She physically recoiled from him, shoving his pleading hand away as if he were diseased, a piece of evidence she needed to discard. "I don't know anything about this," she shrieked, her voice suddenly shrill and ugly, stripped of all its practiced elegance. She pointed a trembling, accusing finger at her own son. "It was all him. He tricked me. He's the one with the debts. He told me this was the best way to manage the estate. The toxic alliance imploded right before our eyes. The two of them, so united in their greed just minutes before, now turned on each other with a viciousness that was both pathetic and horrifying. It was the predictable, ugly end to a partnership built on lies and selfishness. I had seen enough. I stood up, my chair making a soft, scraping sound on the floor. I didn't look at them. I didn't say a word to them. They were no longer my problem. They were just two rats in a trap of their own making. I looked at Silas, who gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod of victory. "Our work here is done," I said, my voice clear and steady. Then I turned my back on them. I walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage, the shouting, the accusations, and the pathetic, unraveling lies. I left them to drown in the ashes of a family that had just burned itself to the ground. The day after the meeting, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no elation, no surge of victory. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness. The adrenaline from the battle had drained away completely, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that seeped into my soul. The war was over, but the battlefield was silent and desolate. I drove aimlessly, eventually finding myself heading west towards the water. I ended up at Discovery Park, parking my truck and walking the trails until I reached the shoreline of the Puget Sound. I found a large weathered driftwood log, smoothed by years of salt and waves, and sat down. The gray water lapped gently against the rocky beach, the sky a blanket of muted white. The air was cool and clean. I sat there for hours, just watching the tide, and I finally allowed myself to feel everything without judgment. The profound relief that the fighting was over, the soul-crushing exhaustion, and beneath it all, a deep, aching sadness. It wasn't sadness for Genevieve or for Kaylin. It was sadness for me, for the little girl who had spent a lifetime trying to earn a mother's love, for the family that could have been, the one that had existed only in my hopes. I had won. But victory had a bitter, lonely taste. The court order came through. Genevieve and Kaylin were given 48 hours to vacate the premises. My phone buzzed one last time. A notification I had been half expecting. A final voicemail from my mother. I hesitated, then pressed play, needing to hear the final echo of her voice. It was no longer the sharp command of a matriarch, nor the cloying sweetness of a manipulator. It was weak, whining. A pathetic, rambling plea filled with revisionist history, a litany of all the sacrifices she had made for me, painting me as the ungrateful, monstrous child. It ended with a familiar, trailing phrase, a guilt trip she had used my entire life. "After everything I've done for you." I listened to the very end. I felt no anger, not anymore. Just a distant, clinical pity for a woman so trapped in her own lies she could no longer see the truth. I didn't call back. I didn't save the message. I simply held my finger down on the screen, watched the little trash can icon appear, and deleted it forever. Then I went into her contact information and pressed block. It wasn't an act of anger. It was a necessary amputation. It was like cutting away a diseased limb to save the rest of the body. A few days later, I drove back to the house in Port Blossom. The court had confirmed it was empty. As I stepped inside, the faint, cloying scent of Genevieve's expensive perfume still lingered in the air, a ghostly reminder of her presence. I walked past the living room, past the dining room, and went straight to the back of the house, to my father's workshop. I slid open the heavy wooden door. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The air smelled of pine shavings, linseed oil, and old, honest work. His tools hung neatly on the pegboard wall, each one clean and in its proper place. And there, on his workbench, sat a small, unfinished rocking chair. He had started building it after I'd mentioned, just once, the idea of adopting a child someday. It was a dream I had barely spoken aloud, a future that had never come to be. The little chair was made of solid oak, its pieces carefully joined but not yet sanded or polished. It was a symbol of a grandfather's hope, a future he never got to see. I sank to the floor, the sawdust soft beneath my knees. I reached out and pulled the unfinished chair into my lap, hugging its rough, sturdy frame to my chest. And for the first time since this all began, I cried. It wasn't a cry of anger or frustration. It was a cry of pure, undiluted grief. I cried for my wonderful, honorable father. I cried for the little girl inside me who had finally stopped waiting for her mother to love her. I cried for the ghost of the family that could have existed, but never did. It was a final, gut-wrenching farewell to a dream I had to let die. It was the release of a pain I had carried for a lifetime. When the tears finally subsided, leaving me empty and calm, I stood up. I took a piece of scrap paper from my father's workbench and his flat-sided carpenter's pencil. I didn't write a letter to my mother. I wrote one to myself. I forgive myself for looking for love in a barren place. I forgive myself for staying silent for so long. As of today, my boundaries are made of steel. This door is closed. I folded the note into a small square and tucked it deep inside the unfinished frame of the rocking chair. A silent promise to my father and to the person I was becoming. A foundation for a new life. Then, I pulled out my phone. The legal war was over. Now, the reconstruction could begin. I scrolled through my contacts and made a call. "Hello," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I'm calling to get an estimate from a general contractor." 6 months later. The house in Port Blossom was transformed. The gaping hole in the sunroom, once a scar of betrayal, was now a solid wall with a large, beautiful bay window that looked out onto the garden. The house itself had been repainted a calming slate blue, the color of the sea on an overcast day. But the most significant change wasn't in the structure. It was in the spirit. It was in the handcrafted oak sign that hung by the entrance, its letters carved with care. It read, "The Bland Fortress, a haven for women veterans." The sounds of hammers and saws had long since faded, replaced by something much better. The sound of laughter and quiet conversation. The oppressive scent of Genevieve's perfume was gone, replaced by the smell of fresh coffee and baking bread. The house was no longer a monument to betrayal. It was a sanctuary of healing, a safe harbor for women who, like me, were navigating the difficult waters of returning home. It was a fortress built not of stone, but of shared understanding and resilience. I was in the garden, kneeling in the soft, dark earth next to a young Army veteran named Maria. She had only arrived a week ago, her eyes still holding the haunted, distant look I knew so well. We were planting a rhododendron bush, a gift that had arrived with a handwritten letter from Sully. He told me that my story had inspired his wife, who had also survived a toxic family, and they wanted to contribute to the new garden. The rhododendron, Washington's state flower, felt like the perfect symbol of new life taking root in native soil. I didn't talk to Maria about combat or trauma. I talked to her about soil, about the way to gently loosen the root ball without causing it stress. I showed her how to build a small mound of earth to support the plant. "It takes time," I told her, my voice soft. "Sometimes the roots need a while to learn to trust the new ground. But eventually," I said, patting the soil around the base of the plant, "it will bloom." She looked up at me, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She knew I wasn't just talking about the rhododendron. In that quiet moment, I passed on the most important lesson I had learned, the power of patience and the unwavering belief in the possibility of rebirth. That evening, I was in my father's workshop, the place that now felt like the true heart of the fortress. The small oak rocking chair was finished. I had sanded it until it was smooth as silk and applied coat after coat of varnish, just as my father had taught me. Its surface glowed with a warm, deep luster. It was no longer a symbol of a future lost. It was a gift for a future found. It would go to the first baby born to a resident of the fortress. I sat at my father's workbench, opened my laptop, and saw an email from Silas Croft. It was a simple, factual update. Public records showed that Genevieve was now living in a modest, state-funded care facility. Kaylin, after filing for bankruptcy, had moved to another state, disappearing into the vast anonymity of the country. They hadn't been defeated in a blaze of glory. They had simply faded away, like ghosts. Their power over me was gone, and without it, they were nothing. I closed the laptop. There was no surge of vindictive pleasure, no triumphant glee. There was only a final, profound, and lasting peace. I brewed a cup of tea and stepped out onto the back porch. The sun was setting over the Puget Sound, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. The salty air was mixed with the delicious, smoky smell of a barbecue. Zara was at the grill, flipping burgers, laughing with Sully, who had become a regular volunteer. A few of the other women were setting up a long picnic table, their voices and laughter carrying on the evening breeze. I leaned against the railing, the warm mug in my hands, and I watched them. I watched this incredible, resilient, beautiful family that had been forged in the fires of shared experience. My chosen family. A slow smile spread across my face. I hadn't just won back a house. I had taken a place of brokenness and rebuilt it into a legacy of strength. I had stared into the darkest night of my life and refused to let it consume me. Instead, I had built my own dawn. And that was the greatest victory of all. And so, I built my own dawn. It wasn't easy, and the scars are still there, not on my skin, but deeper. They're a map of where I've been, but they no longer dictate where I'm going. My story is proof that the most important fortress you can ever build is the one inside yourself, with boundaries made of steel and a foundation of self-worth. If my journey has resonated with you, or if you've ever had to fight to reclaim your own peace, please let this story be a reminder that you are not alone. Your strength is real. For more stories about resilience, survival, and finding your own dawn, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these important journeys with others who need to hear them.